In just 7 minutes, one black congresswoman dismantled a political ambush without shouting, without interrupting, without even standing. She didn't flip the table. She flipped the narrative. Her name is Jasmine Crockett. And on that day, inside a congressional hearing built to silence her, she didn't just defend herself. She exposed a strategy, shattered a performance, and forced an entire room to reckon with the sound of undeniable truth. The gavel slammed. The chairwoman shouted. The cameras rolled. But when the moment came, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. So what did she say that left a room full of power speechless? What silence was so powerful, so precise, that even her opponents couldn't look her in the eye? And more importantly, what does that silence tell us about justice in America today? This isn't just a story about politics. It's about presence, about what happens when one woman refuses to be written out of the script, and instead writes the next line of history herself. Let's go back to where it began. Room 2141, 3 minutes before the gavel dropped. It looked like any other hearing on the surface. The long wooden dais, the polished microphones, the carefully aligned water bottles. But there was something off about room 2141 that morning. Something too rehearsed, too quiet. Like a stage set for a play no one admitted they were performing. Outside, a light drizzle painted the windows in blurred gray streaks. The kind of Washington morning that smudged the skyline and made truth feel further away than usual. Inside, staffers moved briskly, clutching folders and exchanging whispers that sounded more like cues than strategy. Cables were taped down with surgical precision. The lighting was tested twice, and every camera, every single one, had its red light blinking, ready to catch the exact moment the story would unfold. At the center of it all sat Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. She didn't just arrive, she entered, styled in bold red, framed by an entourage and radiating the quiet confidence of someone who believed the ending was already written. She adjusted her microphone like it was a crown, gave her team a sharp nod, and reviewed her notes one last time. Except they weren't notes. They were attacks, scripted sound bites. The kind that weren't meant to inform. They were meant to wound. This wasn't just a hearing. This was an ambush disguised as agenda. The session was officially titled, Oversight on Women's Athletic Protections. But everyone in the room knew better. This wasn't about sports, it was about control. It was about using one issue to silence another. And at the heart of it, whether she had planned it or not, was Jasmine Crockett. She walked in alone. No entourage, no makeup team. Just a black leather folder pressed against her chest, and a pen already uncapped in her hand. She wore dark navy, unassuming, understated. But her eyes told a different story. They scanned the room slowly, absorbing the tension, the trap, and the tempo. She didn't flinch. If Greene was the opening act, Jasmine was the quiet storm waiting off stage. No one said it, but everyone felt it. As Jasmine found her seat, 4 places to Greene's left, one staffer glanced up, then immediately looked away. Another reached for their phone, then hesitated. Something was about to happen. Something unscripted. Greene, still pretending to review her pages, stole a look at Jasmine and caught her gaze for half a second. But instead of confrontation, Jasmine just offered the tiniest nod, as if to say, I see you. I've read the script, and I didn't come here to act. The air thickened. A soft cough from the gallery, a gavel in the distance. A page flipped in Jasmine's folder, neatly, quietly, deliberately. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a countdown to something no one had planned for, to someone no one could stop. 3 minutes remained before the gavel dropped, and none of them knew that in exactly 7 minutes, the woman they tried to silence would turn this room into a reckoning. The room was wired for tension, every angle, every mic, every breath. But Jasmine Crockett sat still, composed in a way that seemed almost misplaced among the nervous energy vibrating around her. Her fingers gently grazed the edge of her leather folder, her pen resting lightly between 2 fingers, not as a weapon, but as a witness. Around her, chaos disguised itself in polite gestures. staffers walking a little too fast, voices pitched just below the threshold of urgency, eyes darting to Greene every time she shifted in her chair. And yet, in the center of it all, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't lean in, didn't stiffen. She just breathed, steady, quiet, present. To understand that composure, you have to go back, before the microphones, before the Capitol, before the name Crockett trended online. You'd have to picture a girl with sand-scuffed shoes on cracked Texas pavement, where justice was something you overheard grown-ups whisper about but rarely saw delivered. Jasmine was raised in a household where her mother, Denise, wore her nursing badge like armor, and her father, Calvin, taught high school history like it was scripture. At night, their conversations didn't revolve around money or gossip. They were about dignity, about who got heard and who didn't, about who the system waited for and who it ignored. She was 12 the first time she saw her mother cry after a shift. A young woman had been turned away from emergency care, bleeding, scared, too poor, too alone. The hospital had rules. The girl had no one. And Jasmine, sitting quietly on the staircase, heard her mother whisper, "She needed help, and we sent her home to die." That was the first time Jasmine understood the weight of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes when systems choose procedure over people. It carved something in her, an unshakable refusal to look away. Years later, as a young public defender in Dallas, Jasmine walked into courtrooms where her clients were treated like afterthoughts. She remembered every name, every face, every mother who didn't show up because she couldn't get off work, every teen boy who was told to take a plea he didn't understand just to get it over with. She didn't raise her voice then either, but she learned to raise something else, the standard. Every motion she filed, every case she argued, it wasn't about shouting louder. It was about standing still when others tried to move past you. And now here she was, back in a room designed to move right past her. They'd counted her out before she spoke a word, labeled her emotional, green, combative, the usual words used when a black woman refuses to fold. But what they hadn't accounted for was the patience she'd cultivated, the discipline born from courtroom after courtroom of being told, "This isn't your turn." Jasmine had long since learned to wait for the silence, because that's when the truth finally lands. She glanced to her right. Greene was adjusting her collar again. Across the room, a Republican aide whispered into another's ear. Jasmine didn't need to listen. She'd seen the playbook a dozen times. Paint her as the radical, the disruptor, the one who makes things about race. But this wasn't about race. This was about receipts, about facts, about watching someone set a stage and knowing you hold the thread that can unravel the entire curtain. She turned one more page in her folder, a quiet rustle, then stillness. 2 minutes now. And the room still hadn't realized that the woman they were preparing to corner was already sharpening the truth they couldn't outrun. The digital clock on the wall ticked toward 8:57 a.m. 3 minutes. That was all the time left before the first gavel drop. 3 minutes before silence became spectacle, before talking points became weapons. And in that space between breath and broadcast, the room vibrated with a tension too thick to name. A staffer coughed once, quickly. Another sipped from a paper cup with a trembling hand, the sound of the plastic lid scraping the rim oddly loud in the stillness. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know what, or from whom. That uncertainty was the most dangerous thing in the room. Marjorie Taylor Greene leaned back in her leather chair, like a queen surveying her court. She tapped her gavel once against the desk. Just enough to be heard, not enough to command. It was a practice stroke, almost theatrical, like a magician testing her wand before the illusion began. She wore the smile of someone rehearsed, a little too smooth, a little too proud. She wasn't nervous. She was waiting for her cue. To her, this wasn't oversight. It was opening night. But something flickered in her expression when her eyes brushed past Jasmine Crockett. A hesitation, small but telling. Because unlike every other Democrat in that room who arrived with statements preloaded and responses pre-scripted, Jasmine had said nothing, not a word, Not even a glance of reaction. She had simply arrived, observed, and read, page after page, as if searching not for facts, but for fractures. And Greene, despite all her confidence, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Across the chamber, a congressional aide adjusted the gain on the microphones. The slight squeak of metal turning was enough to make Greene flinch. Jasmine didn't move. Her pen hovered above a small note she had underlined twice, then paused mid-air, like a pianist waiting for the first chord. Her body language was unreadable. Not defensive, not passive, but something else entirely. Controlled, still, dangerous. To anyone watching, it might have seemed Jasmine was merely reviewing paperwork, but if you look closer, you'd see it was something else. Each gesture was intentional. The page turns were slow, quiet, deliberate. Her pen didn't scribble, it plotted. And her eyes weren't scanning, they were setting a rhythm. She wasn't preparing to speak, she was preparing to strike, but not with volume, with weight. Back row journalists leaned in just slightly, a collective twitch of intuition. They'd covered hundreds of hearings, but this one felt different. There was no shouting yet, no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions. But still, it felt like standing on the edge of a thunderstorm you couldn't see but could feel pulsing just beyond the hills. One reporter whispered to another, "Watch her, the quiet one." Meanwhile, the witnesses were being seated, their papers rustling, their names being quietly confirmed. All according to plan, all exactly as scripted. And yet Greene's fingers drummed a little faster. Her gaze flicked back to Jasmine, who was now closing her folder. Not slowly, not dramatically, just with the kind of finality that says, the wait is over, the moment held. Then came the sound, a chair scooting back. Greene stood up, straightened her blouse, cleared her throat, and the gavel dropped. A sharp, confident crack. But even then, no one realized. They weren't about to witness a hearing. They were about to witness a dismantling. And the woman they underestimated was already writing how this moment would be remembered. The gavel fell like a shot across the bow, sharp, deliberate, and louder than it needed to be. "This committee will come to order," Marjorie Taylor Greene announced, her voice calm, almost mechanical, like someone who had practiced the line in front of a mirror too many times. She paused, letting the echo settle as if waiting for applause that would never come. Then she leaned forward, fixed her gaze not on her fellow lawmakers or the witnesses, but directly into the cameras. Always the cameras. "We're here today," she began, "to address a crisis threatening the integrity of women's sports and, by extension, the safety of American women and girls." Her words fell into the room like ice cubes into still water, meant to appear composed but hiding a flash freeze of panic underneath. The phrasing was careful. Every sentence had been tested for impact. Biological males, locker room safety, fair competition, all phrases meant to trigger a response, to frame dissent as danger. It wasn't new. It was a script, one that had worked before. But today the room felt different. The delivery was smooth, yes, but also slightly hollow, like a singer hitting every note but forgetting the meaning of the lyrics. Greene was speaking, but the weight behind her words was stretched too thin to hold. She kept going. "We're seeing a dangerous trend," she declared, eyes narrowing as if conjuring an invisible enemy. "Biological males are entering women's spaces, dominating competition, and silencing real female athletes who are afraid to speak up." The phrase "real female athletes" hung in the air like a veiled insult. Jasmine Crockett's pen twitched once, then steadied. She didn't raise her eyes, she didn't react. She just underlined a phrase on her notepad, once, then again. Across the aisle, some Republicans nodded silently. Others stayed still. A few exchanged glances, not of approval, but of discomfort. They knew the language had teeth, but it also had risk. They could hear the line she was walking and how close it ran to a cliff. The audience remained quiet. The press pool scribbled. Every camera lens seemed to pull tighter, drawn not to the speaker, but to the stillness just beyond her. Jasmine, unmoved, unreadable. She hadn't said a word, but the air around her was changing. It was subtle, like the moment before a tide shifts direction. No sound, just pressure. Greene's speech reached its crescendo. If we don't act now, she warned, tapping her prepared statement, we risk losing everything we fought for. Title IX protections, fair competition, and most importantly, the right of women to exist in spaces that are truly their own. It was her money line, the one designed for clips and headlines, and she knew it. She paused, letting the silence wrap around it like a ribbon on a gift. No one spoke. Not yet. But across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett finally looked up. Not to interrupt, not to challenge, but simply to observe. And in that moment, for the first time since the hearing began, it was clear. Marjorie wasn't the only one performing. She just didn't know she was already standing in someone else's scene. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. As Greene let the silence after her final sentence stretch like a drum roll, Jasmine simply lowered her eyes and began to write. Not frantically, not even consistently. Each stroke of the pen was slow, intentional, like the opening bars of a symphony no one else could yet hear. She wasn't taking notes to remember. She was preparing to strike, but not with noise, with precision. From the outside, it might have looked like she was ignoring Greene. But those who had studied a courtroom knew better. This was what prosecutors did before a closing argument. This was how defense attorneys prepared to reveal the truth buried beneath hours of noise. She was letting Greene dig deeper and deeper into the role she had written for herself, letting her walk unchecked into the trap. Marjorie didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. She was already moving on. Let me be clear, she added with a forceful breath. This isn't about hate. It's about fairness. It's about truth. She stole a glance at Jasmine, daring her to object. But Jasmine didn't. She turned the page. That act, quiet, restrained, unremarkable to the untrained eye, was the loudest response in the room. It wasn't defiance, it was confirmation. Greene had laid the bait, but Jasmine had laid the groundwork, and she wasn't reacting because she didn't need to. The words were already cataloged, the logic already unraveled, the evidence already prepared. At the far end of the dais, Representative Robert Garcia cleared his throat gently. The kind of throat clear that wasn't about dust, but about drawing breath before doing something brave. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, folding his hands with the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't looking for airtime, only honesty. Before we rush into fear-driven narratives, he said evenly, let's remember what Title IX was actually built for. Inclusion, opportunity, fairness for all women, including trans women. There was no applause. This wasn't the kind of room where people clap for truth. But the silence that followed Garcia's words was no longer neutral. It held friction, the kind that makes people shift in their seats, look at their phones even when they don't buzz. Greene's smile thinned. Point of order, she snapped, slapping her palm on the desk. It wasn't just to interrupt, it was to seize control. Let's keep this hearing on topic, she barked louder now. This isn't a woke lecture about feelings. That word, woke, dropped like a hammer, heavy, weaponized, designed not to clarify, but to silence. Garcia didn't respond. He didn't need to. The tone had shifted, and Greene knew it. Her voice, once confident, now carried an edge. Not of strength, but desperation. She wasn't guiding a conversation anymore. She was fencing in a panic. Across the table, Jasmine lifted her pen again. Not to write this time, but to underline. Once. Twice. A phrase she had already written but knew would matter more in light of what had just been said. Then she folded her hands calmly in front of her. The room watched. She still hadn't spoken. She hadn't challenged, hadn't raised her voice. But somehow everyone could feel it. The trap wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real, and it had already begun to close. The hearing resumed its rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. It was subtle, like the tension in a room after someone says what everyone was too afraid to voice. Greene tried to regain control, calling on the next witness, stiffening her posture, reapplying the tone of command in her voice. But it was no longer landing the same. The narrative thread she had begun to weave had loosened, and somewhere behind that unraveling was Jasmine Crockett, still seated quietly, still untouched by the rising heat in the room. But not idle, never idle. To most observers, Jasmine's calm might have looked like passivity, the kind of restraint people often mistake for silence. But there's a difference between not speaking and choosing not to speak, between submission and strategy. Jasmine wasn't avoiding confrontation. She was timing it. Every second she withheld her voice made it sharper when it would finally cut through. Every word she didn't say was building pressure for the ones she would. That strategy of patience, of pacing, hadn't been learned in classrooms or on podiums. It had been learned in courtrooms, in holding cells, in overheated offices where women cried over eviction notices and young men were booked for the crime of being seen. Jasmine had built her political muscle not by outshouting the system, but by outlasting it. She knew that timing wasn't a tactic, it was everything. And so she waited through the next testimony where an invited witness cited distorted statistics with just enough polish to sound official. Waited as Greene nodded along, satisfied to hear her views echoed with academic accent. Waited even as the witness fumbled when pressed on sources, and Greene brushed past the moment like a smudge on her narrative. Jasmine listened, not just to what was said, but to what was missing. She took a slow sip of water, then returned her pen to the same line she had underlined before. Still, she said nothing. The cameras began to shift, one pan slightly toward her, as if drawn by gravity rather than direction. Another, from a press crew near the back, recentered the frame. Not on Greene, not on the speaker, but on Jasmine. She wasn't talking, but her silence had become the center of the story. In a hearing designed for outrage, her restraint had become the disruption. Viewers watching at home might not have been able to articulate it, but they felt it. That this woman, the only one not flailing, not performing, was the one in control. The comments started pouring into livestream chats. Why isn't she speaking yet? She's waiting to strike. Smart move. She's watching them build their own trap. And inside the room, Marjorie Taylor Greene felt it too. Her glances toward Jasmine became more frequent, more uneasy. Her tone sharpened. She was talking more, not less. And every time she tried to escalate the rhetoric, radical gender ideology, protecting real women, the words landed with less impact. Not because they were softer, but because there was now something stronger in the room. The presence of a woman who wasn't reacting, only preparing. It was a shift no gavel could command. No committee rules could define. Jasmine's calm was no longer stillness. It was tension, coiled and calculating. And everyone in that room, even those too proud to admit it, could feel that moment approaching. The moment where her silence would end, and the reckoning would begin. The moment didn't announce itself. There was no sudden flare, no raised voice, no dramatic interruption. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Jasmine Crockett slowly placed her pen down, lifted her eyes from the notes she had sharpened like blades, and raised her hand, just slightly, with the kind of deliberate ease that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Madam Chair," she said, her voice even, smooth, almost polite, "I'd like to reserve some time for remarks." The words were modest, respectful, but they landed like a judge's verdict. Not because they were loud, but because they were earned. Greene stiffened. She hadn't expected Jasmine to speak so soon, or perhaps not at all. She blinked once, glanced around, pretending to consult the agenda in front of her. "We'll get to that," she said tersely, her tone clipped, buying time. "Let's allow the witnesses to finish." But it didn't matter. The request had been made calmly, confidently, and more importantly, publicly. Jasmine had claimed her ground. She hadn't begged. She hadn't forced. She had asked quietly and dared the chairwoman to deny her. That was the power of the moment. Not in confrontation, but in posture. In knowing exactly when to rise without needing to stand. Jasmine didn't argue. She nodded once and returned her gaze to the table. But everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. Something had shifted. She had made her presence undeniable without speaking more than 15 words. The silence that followed wasn't like before. It had weight now, like the pause before a verdict is read or the beat before an orchestra erupts. Viewers at home leaned in. Reporters in the gallery glanced at one another, with that barely visible shift of instinct that said, "It's about to happen." The hearing carried on, technically, but everyone's focus was elsewhere. When Jasmine finally spoke again, it was nearly 12 minutes after Greene's first gavel. The chamber had settled into its usual rhythm: sound bites, performative questions, posturing. But none of it mattered, because when Jasmine leaned forward into her microphone, the entire room stilled. There was no warning, just a flip of a page, and then a single razor-line sentence. "You know," she began casually, as if picking up mid-thought, "I just found out today, on my 44th birthday, that the Republican Party is here to save women." A few seconds passed before the sarcasm settled in. The room cracked, not with laughter, not with outrage, but with disbelief, controlled, surgical, the kind of line that doesn't explode. It poisons slowly. Jasmine didn't pause for effect. She didn't wait for reactions. She kept going, voice smooth, tone warm, eerily warm. "It's funny because I must have missed the memo. All those years fighting for equal pay, reproductive autonomy, protection from violence, and now I find out I had saviors this whole time?" Greene looked down. For the first time that morning, her fingers stopped moving. Her carefully built rhythm had been broken, not by noise but by the terrifying precision of someone who had waited to speak until she could speak with force. And Jasmine wasn't done. Not even close. She had waited her turn, and now every word that followed would land like a stone dropped into glass. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power wasn't in her volume. It was in her velocity. With every sentence, she peeled back a layer of pretense, revealing not just contradictions, but choices. Legislative choices. Moral ones. "Let's talk about what protecting women has looked like under Republican leadership," she said, flipping to the first marked page in her folder. "Because y'all seem real good at the title, but the track record? That's another story entirely." There was no movement across the dais, only stillness. Eyes darted, throats cleared quietly. Greene didn't look up. Jasmine continued. "In the past 100 days," she began, "this Congress, under Republican control, voted to cut funding for domestic violence survivor services. Not proposed, voted, passed through committee, and not just by mistake. You held the pen. You signed it." Her finger tapped the edge of the document in front of her, loud enough to punctuate, soft enough to remain poised. "That's not a rumor. That's not Twitter. That's not spin. That's federal legislation. You want to protect women? Then tell me, why did you gut the very programs that helped them survive abuse?" A murmur rippled from the gallery. Press members typed more urgently. Some members of the committee shifted in their seats. But Jasmine was already turning to the next page. "And while we're on the subject of protection," she said, her tone tightening just slightly, "let's talk about health, because you also voted to eliminate funding for women's health research. Breast cancer studies, ovarian cancer trials, maternal mortality tracking. Gone." She looked up briefly. Her gaze didn't search. It settled. What kind of protector turns off the alarm when the house is already on fire? Silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything now would only prove her point. Across the dais, Greene's posture remained upright, but her knuckles were whitening around the base of her gavel. Jasmine wasn't aiming at her directly, but the trajectory of every word led straight to her chair. "Let's not forget the SAVE Act," Jasmine continued, now almost conversational, as though walking the committee through a bedtime story rewritten into a warning. "A bill dressed up as voting reform, but written in a way that would disproportionately disenfranchise women, especially women of color, especially women who live in low-income neighborhoods where polling access is already a joke." Her eyes met Greene's for the briefest moment. "You say you're saving us. From what? From our own voices?" She let the question hang. Not for drama, but for weight. And it did hang, like a blade over the very idea that this hearing was ever about fairness in the first place. Jasmine flipped the last page in her folder. The soft thwack of paper felt louder than any gavel strike. "What I see," she said, "is a party claiming to defend women while quietly stripping away every system designed to protect them. That's not defense. That's deception. For a second, just one, Greene's facade cracked. Not with words, not with an outburst, but with the smallest shift in her eyes. The look of someone realizing that the spotlight she had turned on her opponent was now exposing her own record, and there was nowhere to hide. Jasmine paused, then folded her notes with care, not to rest, but to prepare for what came next. Because she wasn't done yet. She had only just opened the box, and there was still one more truth they hadn't dared say out loud. Jasmine didn't raise her chin, didn't square her shoulders, didn't take on the theatrics so many in that room had come to expect from televised confrontation. She stayed seated, hands folded gently atop her closed folder, her tone deceptively soft. But the stillness around her had turned electric, because everyone could feel it. The next words would not be policy. They would be personal, they would be precise, and no one, not even Greene with her gavel clutched like a weapon, was ready for what came next. "We're not fooled by costumes," Jasmine said quietly, almost as if confiding in the room. "Especially not the ones that look like savior, but sound like control." There was no mistaking the meaning, the red, white, and blue rhetoric, the performative patriotism, the invocation of womanhood only when politically convenient. Jasmine wasn't just calling it out, she was stripping it bare. Greene's head twitched toward her. Her eyes flared wide for just a moment, then narrowed, jaw locking into place. Her gavel hand twitched, but she didn't slam it. Not yet. Maybe she knew, on some level, that to interrupt Jasmine now would only confirm everything being exposed. Maybe even she understood. The mask had already slipped. "You see," Jasmine continued, her voice gaining weight without gaining volume, "there's a certain kind of performance that happens in this room. A script that says, if you talk fast enough, shout loud enough, and wrap your prejudice in motherhood and morality, no one will question the lie underneath." She paused, not for drama, but for breath. Her control was surgical, her focus unbreakable. "But I grew up around women who didn't have the luxury of performing. Women who didn't wear their pain for cameras, who didn't talk about protection. They just did it, quietly, fiercely, every day. And not once did they need to silence someone else to feel powerful." Across the dais, Greene's stillness had begun to unravel. One of her aides leaned toward her, whispering something low and urgent, but she waved them off. Her knuckles were now white against the wood. Jasmine wasn't addressing her by name, but her words were wrapping tighter and tighter around her like a vice. "I'm not here to debate dignity," Jasmine said. "I'm not here to convince anyone of my humanity. That's a game y'all can play among yourselves. What I'm here to say, for the record, for the people watching, for the little girls growing up thinking power only comes in one form, is this." She turned her head, slowly, deliberately, just enough to meet Greene's gaze. "You don't get to vote against shelter funding and then call yourself a guardian. You don't get to ignore maternal mortality rates and then wear the cape of a savior. You don't get to silence women at the ballot box and then pretend you're giving them a microphone. No shouting, no pounding, just truth, folded into language like iron under velvet." Greene finally reached for her gavel, but Jasmine was already done, not silenced, finished. Because when the truth is said with that kind of clarity, even the loudest lie loses its echo. The gavel struck wood, once, loud, almost angry, but it didn't reclaim control. It only marked what everyone in the room already knew. The woman they tried to embarrass had just defined the moment. The gavel slammed down with a force that startled even the aides seated nearby. "You are out of time," Greene barked, her voice rising half an octave higher than she intended. The sharpness of it cut through the chamber, but not with authority. No, it carried something else now. Something thin, something cracking. The mask of control she'd worn since the beginning of the hearing was beginning to fray at the edges. And worse, everyone saw it. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She sat perfectly still, her fingers resting on her folder, her gaze unwavering. The room watched her, not Greene, because somehow in that split second of reaction, in the high-pitched panic behind Greene's outburst, the roles had reversed. Jasmine was calm, grounded, And Greene, despite the title stitched to her nameplate, was spiraling. "I said your time is up," Greene repeated, now gripping the gavel as if it were the last thing anchoring her. She looked around the room, seeking reinforcement. Any kind of nod, an ally's eyes, a procedural save. But none came. Even the Republicans around her sat stiff, unsure of whether to look at her or at the woman across the aisle who had just detonated a truth bomb without raising her voice. Greene's fingers twitched once more. Then the gavel came down again. Harder, louder, but still to no effect. Because power, real power, doesn't live in sound. It lives in silence. And Jasmine's silence, now so deliberate, so precise, was cutting deeper than any rebuttal could. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply looked at Greene with the kind of patience that only someone who has seen systems collapse on themselves can master. And that look, that terrifying, calm certainty, said everything. Across the press row, journalists began to shift in their seats. Phones were lifted without sound. Fingers flew across keyboards. No one wanted to miss what was unfolding, not because of the policy, not even because of the spectacle, but because they all recognized the rarest moment in public discourse, the moment when someone in power loses their grip and the world watches it in real time. "You will respect the rules of this committee," Greene snapped, her voice cracking at the edge of the sentence. She cleared her throat, tried again. "Congresswoman Crockett, you're—" But she didn't finish. Her tongue pressed to the inside of her cheek, searching for words that hadn't been scripted. There was no planned insult left to lean on. No procedural outburst she could fall into. The show had moved on, and she hadn't realized she was no longer in control of the script. Jasmine finally moved. Not much. Just a slight tilt of her head, the smallest shift in posture. But it was enough. Her calm wasn't passive, it was assertion. She didn't need to shout to be heard. The room was already listening. And Greene, well, Greene had just made the fatal mistake of trying to silence a woman whose strength didn't depend on a microphone. The gavel fell once more, harder than before, but it echoed empty. Because no matter how many times she struck it, Greene couldn't undo what had just been said, and she certainly couldn't reclaim the power she had already lost. The gavel came down again, harder this time, sharp and offbeat, a sound that once signaled control, now echoing with desperation. Greene didn't announce anything. She didn't restore order. She just struck the desk again and again, as if trying to reclaim the rhythm that had slipped out from under her. Each crack rang louder than the last, but instead of silencing the room, it exposed something raw. Vulnerability, panic, fear. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't react. She simply watched. And in doing so, she said everything. Her stillness had become unbearable. Not for the audience, not for the press, but for Greene, who had built her presence on being the loudest voice in the room. Now that voice was flailing. Every syllable that came from her mouth landed off balance like someone walking on heels across breaking glass. "I am the chair of this committee," Greene declared, her voice pinched now, the polished edges replaced by strain. "And I said, your time is up." Her hand shook slightly as she pointed the gavel, not in a gesture of procedure, but like a weapon losing weight in midair. She looked around, hoping someone would jump in, an aide, a colleague, even a murmur of agreement. But the silence that greeted her was as complete as it was damning. Across the room, the press pool leaned forward, not with excitement, but with recognition. This wasn't just a procedural clash. This was the unraveling of a performance. Greene's power had always depended on control, on dominating tone, tempo, and fear. But in this moment, with the cameras rolling and the air thick with reckoning, her fear had turned inward. Her own voice was betraying her. And Jasmine? She hadn't said another word. She didn't have to. Her silence had become indictment. Her composure, proof. With every strike of the gavel, Greene wasn't silencing Jasmine. She was exposing herself. Each loud crack became a confession. "I'm not in control anymore. I'm afraid I can't stop what's happening." Then Jasmine leaned forward, just slightly, and placed her hand back on the microphone. She didn't turn it on. She didn't speak. But the gesture alone sent a ripple through the room. She wasn't grabbing attention. She was commanding readiness. It was a signal, not to challenge, but to declare. You don't get to decide when truth ends. Greene slammed the gavel again. You're out of order, she shouted. But it wasn't Jasmine who was out of order. It was the script, the illusion, the very idea that dominance equals leadership. Her voice cracked at the edges now, not with volume, but with collapse. Even her posture had shifted, shoulders raised, lips pursed, hair slightly undone. She looked less like a chairwoman and more like someone trying not to be undone in public. And all the while, Jasmine sat steady. She didn't raise her eyes. She didn't roll them. She didn't speak out of turn. And that, more than anything, made Greene's unraveling worse. Because it forced the room and the audience watching to see the truth. The woman yelling wasn't holding power. She was losing it, loudly. Each slam of the gavel wasn't a call for order. It was a surrender masked in noise, a desperate attempt to restore a hierarchy that had already collapsed. And in the quiet that followed that last trembling strike, something became crystal clear. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't out of order. She was the new order arriving. There was a long pause. Not the kind that comes from confusion, but the kind that follows collapse. Greene sat back ever so slightly, the gavel still clutched in her hand like a lifeline, her eyes scanning the room for something, anything to hold on to. But the silence around her wasn't empty. It was full, full of consequence, full of eyes watching her unravel, full of the echo of Jasmine Crockett's poise. Then Jasmine leaned in. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. But the moment her mic light turned green, the air changed again. It wasn't anticipation, it was certainty. Jasmine didn't speak to Greene. She didn't even look at her. She looked forward, into the room, into the cameras, into the very idea of government itself, and spoke with the calm only truth can carry. "This isn't your stage, Congresswoman," she said, her voice smooth and steady. "This is the people's house." There it was. 7 words that felt like thunder without raising a single decibel. 7 words that tore through the performance, stripped the set, and turned the spotlight outward. Onto the people watching from across the country who had grown tired of theater disguised as governance. Greene blinked. Her lips parted, but nothing came. No script, no soundbite, no practiced jab. She looked at her staffers. One had frozen, mid-gesture. Another subtly put down a notepad. Even her own party sat still, as though they too had recognized that something irreversible had just been spoken into the record. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She let the words settle not as a jab, but as a reckoning. "You don't get to turn this room into a podium for personal power," she continued. "Not when mothers are dying from lack of health care. Not when survivors are being turned away from shelters. Not when children are afraid to go to school because protection has become a performance, not a promise." Her voice didn't rise, it deepened. "This place," she said, motioning gently to the walls around her, "was built for debate, for dissent, for democracy, not for show, not for headlines, not for people who mistake volume for vision." The press row went still. Even the hum of laptop fans seemed to fall quiet. In the gallery, a woman in her 60s pressed her hand to her chest. A younger man lowered his phone. Not because he didn't want to record, but because, for a moment, he just wanted to witness. Jasmine wasn't tearing anyone down. She was lifting something up, something older than any of them, but long buried under layers of noise and ego. She was reminding them that power, real power, doesn't come from how loud you are. It comes from who you're speaking for. "And if that makes people uncomfortable," she finished, her voice softening to a whisper, "then maybe it's time they sat in silence long enough to listen." She clicked off her mic. No further comment, no final flourish, just the truth, left hanging in the air like incense in a sacred space. Marjorie Taylor Greene said nothing. She couldn't. Her gavel rested on the desk now, still within reach, but suddenly useless. Because a gavel can command sound, but not respect. Not after that. And across the country, from coffee shops to congressional offices, that line was already echoing. "This isn't your stage. It's the people's house." The cameras had stopped rolling. The public had filed out. The microphones were unplugged. But the tension, That thick, electric tension hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply moved rooms. 2 doors down from the now empty chamber of room 2141, a heavy oak door shut with a dull thud. Inside, the air was cooler, stiller. A table stood at the center, polished oval, surrounded by 7 chairs, though only 5 were occupied. No nameplates, no press, just voices low enough to pass for whispers, but tight enough to slice through the room like wire. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat at the head of the table. Her blazer had been exchanged for a cardigan. Her hair, once pinned and defiant, now hung slightly off-center. She wasn't angry, not exactly, but her silence pulsed with something worse: calculation. "We lost the room," one aide said, barely above a breath. The others didn't argue. They didn't need to. Another slid a printed transcript across the table. It was only a partial draft. Jasmine Crockett's closing remarks highlighted in yellow, line by line, like a series of pressure points. One sentence had been circled in red pen 3 times. "This isn't your stage. It's the people's house." "We tried to steer the hearing," another staffer muttered, eyes still locked on the page. "But she didn't play into the fight. She didn't give us the soundbite we needed. She made us look loud, and her still." Greene didn't respond. She just tapped the edge of her coffee cup. Once, twice. Then she finally looked up. "She made it personal," she said flatly. "But she did it without ever naming me. That's worse." "Ma'am," an advisor started cautiously, "we're getting emails already. Moderate donors, suburban groups, even some internal polls shifting. They're not angry. They're impressed. People are quoting her, not our witnesses." Greene's jaw tensed. She looked to the far end of the room where Congressman Haskins, a senior Republican from Utah, sat with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "What?" she asked. "She didn't just outplay you," he said slowly. "She made you irrelevant. That's a problem for all of us." The room fell silent again. Not the respectful kind, the strategic kind. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Greene stood. "Fine," she said. "Let them post their clips. Let them hashtag their slogans. But this isn't over." And as she walked out, her voice dropped to a mutter meant only for herself. "She may have won the room, but I still control the halls." But even she didn't sound convinced. By the following morning, something had shifted, quietly but unmistakably. It didn't happen with fireworks. It wasn't in the headlines just yet. But in the corridors of Capitol Hill, the change was already echoing in the spaces where strategy meets survival. Staffers whispered longer at coffee carts. Aides from opposite offices exchanged guarded glances. And the phrase "people's house" had begun to take on a new kind of weight. At 7:14 a.m., a senior advisor to a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania forwarded a link to his chief of staff. No subject line, just a video. Jasmine Crockett's voice, steady and quiet, filled the screen. "This isn't your stage. It's the people's house." The reply was 2 words. "We're exposed." That was the beginning. By 9:45 a.m., internal polling from 3 battleground districts showed a strange but clear trend. Increased favorability for Jasmine Crockett, not among progressive voters, but among undecideds, among independents, among suburban women over 50, the kind of voters both parties fight hardest to reach. And that's when the phone started ringing. "She's not yelling. She's not blaming. She's just making sense. My daughter sent me the clip. I watched it 3 times. I don't even know what side she's on. I just know she sounded like a leader." These weren't fanatics. These weren't donors. These were regular people, viewers, voters, taxpayers who had long tuned out the circus, who had come to see hearings not as governance, but as soundbite theater. But now they were listening again. And it wasn't just outside the Capitol. Inside, the tremor was starting to reach higher floors. At noon, a Republican communication strategist sat down with Greene's media team. The meeting was short, tense. "She made you look like noise," he said. "And if you don't change tone, fast, you're going to become the face of what people want gone." Greene didn't take it well. "She ambushed me," she hissed. "She waited. the strategist corrected. And you walked into it. That afternoon, Greene's office released a short, clipped statement. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even direct. Just a vague reaffirmation of her commitment to fairness in sports and women's safety. But no one cared. The press didn't pick it up. The public didn't engage. The moment had already passed her. Because while Greene's team was trying to salvage optics, Jasmine Crockett wasn't speaking at all. She hadn't tweeted. She hadn't posted a single quote. She gave no interviews. And that silence, that graceful refusal to feed the machine, only made her louder. On the Hill, younger lawmakers began referencing her speech in their own committee remarks. As Congresswoman Crockett reminded us last week, became a line repeated on the record. And suddenly Greene's hearing, once meant to be her moment, had become Jasmine's legacy. It was slow, it was quiet, but it was unstoppable. Because the beginning of the end doesn't always arrive with a crash. Sometimes it begins with a woman refusing to raise her voice, and a country finally hearing her because of it. It started like most viral moments do, quietly. No flashing banner, no music. Just a handheld repost from a C-SPAN stream, pixelated slightly from compression, but sharp where it mattered. It showed Jasmine Crockett sitting still, then leaning forward, then speaking only 7 words. "This isn't your stage. It's the people's house." The clip lasted just 42 seconds. No flashy editing, no narration, no reaction shots. Just the raw silence after the gavel and the calm that followed when Crockett broke it. Not with rage, but with resolve. No one interrupted her. No one dared. And in that tiny digital frame, viewers across the country saw something they hadn't seen in years. A politician not performing, but reflecting something larger than herself. It spread like a whisper that couldn't be ignored. By noon the next day, it had over 3.4 million views on Twitter. By midnight, it was stitched into TikToks from college dorm rooms in Ohio, beauty salons in Atlanta, VFW halls in Wisconsin. YouTube commentators analyzed her body language. Former teachers paused their civics lessons to play it aloud. Even people who didn't know her name watched it 3, 4, 5 times, not because they were confused, but because they finally felt clear. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The measured cadence, the steady breath, the complete absence of theatrics. It felt less like a clapback and more like a mirror, held up to power, to performance, to every American who had long forgotten what dignity in public office looked like. One commenter wrote, "She didn't drop a mic, she dropped a standard." Another added, "I didn't know who Jasmine Crockett was. Now I want her in every room where power hides behind performance." News anchors scrambled to catch up. Cable shows aired the clip in full, not just because it was popular, but because there was nothing to trim. Every second mattered. There was no excess, no filler, just impact. Some tried to downplay it, called it lucky timing. Others labeled it a viral moment manufactured by the left. But no one could deny it. Something had landed. Something bigger than the clip itself. It was restraint. It was courage. It was the shock of truth delivered in a tone no one could dismiss. And while others scrambled to frame it, to spin it, to imitate it, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She gave no interviews. She didn't repost it. She didn't even reference it. And that silence became part of its power. In a world of algorithms designed to reward outrage, her quiet clarity broke through like a drum beat in a hollow room. The 42-second clip wasn't a speech. It was a shift. And millions weren't just listening. They were remembering what leadership could sound like. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for a movement. She didn't form a coalition, launch a website, or schedule a press tour. But by the end of the week, the movement had already begun, without branding, without permission, and most strikingly, without her saying another word. In towns big and small, the 42-second clip had become more than a political moment. It had become a language. In high school government classes, students paused their test prep to dissect the tone and framing of her sentence. In neighborhood meetings, residents brought up the people's house like a rallying cry. And in comment sections, usually split along predictable battle lines, people were, for once, nodding in unison. There was no manifesto, no party slogan, just a shared hunger for a different kind of voice. What Jasmine had done was subtle, but seismic. She had reminded people, without needing to preach, that dignity is not a luxury, that composure is not weakness, that speaking last and speaking clearly could sometimes silence centuries of noise. The most unexpected part? The people leading the charge weren't political diehards. They weren't all progressives or partisans. They were school teachers. They were churchgoers. They were retired veterans and first-generation college students. They were people who had tuned out long ago, exhausted by performative outrage, but now felt called, not by spectacle, but by substance. In a bookstore in Minneapolis, a tote bag appeared with the phrase, "It's the people's house." It sold out in 3 days. A tattoo artist in Charlotte inked the quote across a client's forearm beside an American flag. In a university forum in Denver, students led a panel titled "Quiet Power: How to Speak When It Matters Most," and cited Jasmine's hearing as the turning point. And Jasmine? She remained on the sidelines, not to be coy, but because she understood something most people in Washington had long forgotten. The movement wasn't about her. It never was. She had opened the door, but it was the people who chose to walk through it. And that's why it stuck. That's why it grew. It wasn't a brand. It was a mirror. And people, especially those long ignored, were finally seeing themselves in it. Even on Capitol Hill, the tremors could be felt. During a closed-door strategy meeting, a veteran Republican consultant warned his clients, "It's not about Crockett, it's about what she's unlocked. If we mock this moment, we mock the very thing people are desperate for, decency that doesn't apologize." Meanwhile, a group of freshman Congress women across party lines quietly formed a caucus to explore bipartisan reforms on decorum and witness rights. Unprecedented, unprompted, and entirely inspired by that one hearing. Still, Jasmine didn't speak. She let the silence stretch. Let the movement breathe without her hand guiding it. Because when a voice speaks for something larger than itself, its job isn't to lead the parade, it's to step aside and make room for others to rise. And that, perhaps more than anything, was why people followed her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she never once asked for it. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. It came in a plain envelope, hand-addressed, no media stamp, no official mark. Just ink slightly smudged in the corner and a stamp half peeled. It didn't come through a press request. It wasn't flagged by her staff. Someone had laid it gently on Jasmine Crockett's desk between the stack of briefing memos and the draft legislation notes. And for some reason, before she touched any of those urgent matters, she opened this one first. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded neatly 3 times. The handwriting was careful but uneven, each line slightly slanted, as if written under pressure or hope. It read, "Dear Congresswoman Crockett, my name is Maya R. I'm 14. I live in Detroit. I saw you on YouTube. My mom said you weren't even trying to be famous. You were just telling the truth." She cried when she watched it. "I have a question. When I speak up in class, people say I'm too angry, or too loud, or difficult, but I'm just saying what's real. Sometimes I think if I talk less, people will like me more. But when you said, 'This isn't your stage, it's the people's house,' you didn't yell. You didn't even look mad. But you made everyone listen. How do you speak honestly, without being hated? Sincerely, Maya R., age 14." Jasmine read the letter twice, then once more. She didn't tear up. She didn't sigh. She just held it still for a long moment, as if the page itself were alive, and fragile, and brave. Later that night, when the office was empty and the Capitol halls had gone quiet, she sat at her desk with only the soft amber glow of the lamp beside her. No staff, no press, no camera, just her, a pen, and Maya. Her reply was short, thoughtful, each sentence placed with care. "Dear Maya, sometimes people will hate you for telling the truth. Not because you're wrong, but because they weren't ready to hear you. Speak anyway. Speak with grace, but never with fear. You are not too loud. The world has just been too quiet. And one day someone younger will hear your voice and know they're not alone. With respect and pride, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She folded it, sealed it, and wrote the return address herself. Because this was what it had always been about. Not the headlines, not the hashtags, but the quiet moments where someone sees themselves for the first time and dares to believe they belong in the room. Late in the afternoon, as the Capitol bathed in the last gold of daylight, Jasmine Crockett walked alone down the long corridor, outside room 2141. Her heels clicked softly against the stone floor, steady and unhurried. The building had grown quiet now. No cameras, no gavels, no interruptions. Just the whisper of history settling into its walls. To her left, portraits of past legislators stared down in faded frames, men in dark suits etched in oil and silence. Men who had spoken with thunder and left behind echoes but not always change. Jasmine didn't look up at them. She didn't need to. She had spent her entire life navigating halls just like this, grand, polished, and built to remind you that your place must be earned, never assumed. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't walking those halls as a guest. She was part of the building now, not because she fought for it, but because she refused to fight on its terms. As she passed room 2141, she paused. The door was closed, but she could still hear it in her memory. The pounding of Greene's gavel, the tension before her words, the exact moment the air shifted when silence became strategy. She saw it all again, not as replay, but as reminder. Not far behind her, two aides spoke in hushed tones. She heard her name, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken plainly, as if it had always belonged here. She turned her head slightly and saw her reflection in the glass. Not the congresswoman, not the headline, just Jasmine, tired but composed, with a folder under one arm and the weight of the day finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. In that moment, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt responsible, because power is not what you hold. It's what people place in you when they believe again. And in that silence, after everything, what people had given her wasn't applause. It was trust, and it echoed louder than any gavel ever could. But perhaps the greatest lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind wasn't just what she said, it was how she carried it. In a time when truth is often shouted and rarely heard, she chose to speak it softly, and that made all the difference. She reminded us that courage doesn't always arrive in force. Sometimes it enters quietly through a door left open by patience, sharpened by history, and held wide by those who refuse to be unseen.